Hey friends out there in YouTube land, Rob here. Today I'd like to talk with you about camcorders. Specifically, I want to kind of dive down into Panasonic's HC-X1500 series, a line that I really like, and compare and contrast that over to Canon's XA series, specifically the newer cameras that came out in 2022. So we're talking like the XA60, 65, 70, and 75. Both of these manufacturers make really great camcorders, but if you're looking at this 1/2 inch to 1 inch sensor size range, knowing that there's so much out there, what make these two special, and why would you get one over the other? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in today's video, so I hope you're excited. Let's get into it. So friends, we're going to turn this whole conversation on its head a little bit and kind of do it in a narrative rather than a spec-focused feature. I will talk about specs, but only the ones that I think are most important that I would use because it's my use case. This question actually comes in from a viewer. This is Texas Ranger 2398, and he says, "Hello Rob, how are you doing? And how would you compare the Panasonic 2000 to the new Canon XA70 or 75?" And I'd like to go ahead and make that comparison for you. So Texas Ranger, here's just for you. When we talk about the cameras, we got to think about what I bought in my experience. So please know that I'm going to be giving you my buying decision reasons and cues, but I'm also going to extrapolate. I've used hundreds of cameras over my experience and career as a wedding photographer, videographer, 15 years of doing this. And I think I would have gone with Canon for some reasons, except for a couple that I'll go into here. These might be reasons that would cause you to choose a different camera as well. Now, if you locked me in a room, put a blindfold on me, spun me around, and told me to pick one of those two cameras, the XA70 or 60 and the Panasonic HC-X1500, I would be happy with either. It's not like my feelings would be hurt. Both are extraordinarily capable cameras. I do think that Panasonic and Canon approach a end user design point differently, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. So, as I'm explaining that, I will say up front so that we don't bury the lead, if you were comparing the Canon to the Panasonic, Panasonic's going to do something right out of the bat, and that's going to give you more features. You're going to get 10-bit on the Panasonic HC-X series compared to 8-bit on the even Canon's newest 2022 XA series. So the XA60, 65, 70, and 75 will not do 10-bit. You will get 422 8-bit, and you will get 4K, and it's one of Canon's codecs. Canon is known for having a beautiful codec, but it's not going to be 10-bit. So if that's something for you, Canon doesn't offer it in that price class, which is basically a price with the XA75 in the United States in April. You're right at $2,700. So you can't get 10-bit on it. For 10-bit, you would need to move up to another level of cameras for Canon, not the least of which would be several $1,000s more. Specifically, the 705, 605 series is going to get you into that professional level. You're going to get the 10-bit on any of the Panasonic entry offerings, specifically the HC-X1500 starting at $1,699, all the way up to the CX10. In fact, the CX10 at $2,299 to $2,499, depending on where you buy it, has quite a few more features already built in, but at every price class compared to the Canon. And that's an important feature distinction to make note of. When you get into the Canons, though, you will get something that you're not getting in this class of Panasonic camera. The Panasonic cameras are 1/2.5, which is a 1/2 inch class sensor. In Canon, the 60, the XA60, and the XA65 are both 1/2.3 inch sensors, so comparable 1/2 inch class sensors. However, their XA70 and 75 do move up to the 1 inch sensor type. And let me tell you, that's a big deal. It's as big of a deal moving up to the 1 inch sensor size as it is going to the 10-bit file resolution, the 10-bit color depth. So those two things are huge considerations. Another one to know the difference between is on any of the Canon offerings, you're not going to get 4K 60. You're going to go up to 4K 30, and it might be 29.97 in some cases. And you might get 60 frames per second on the 1080, but you're not getting it on the 4K side. Over here, on any of the Panasonics, on all of their range, you're going to get the 4K 60, and you're going to get a DCI 4K in 24, I believe, but I don't ever use that. So please, if you have that manual or that spec off your head, leave it down below. Now, since we are talking about these things and we kind of went over the spec heavy part of it, I would like to say that I don't really intend for this conversation to be spec heavy, but for me to move into my next discussion point, I had to tell you some of the big differences. So my next discussion point is where I think Canon is kind of failing us as consumers. Now, I don't buy Canons the same reason that I don't buy Nikons. It's not because I didn't think they were beautifully well-engineered cameras. I always did. Come on, man. Nikon, Canon, these cameras are famous. They've made beautiful portraiture and pictures and won awards. People have used them. They're workhorses. So when I was getting into photography, specifically digital, why didn't I get into Canon and Nikon? Well, it was simple. When I was looking back in 2011 and 2010 to get my professional body starting out, which wasn't as professional as you might think. It was an Alpha 57, A57. When I started weddings, I needed something that I could purchase that had enough features that would allow me to do my job, but didn't seem so iterative. And you guys may have been paying attention to all of the stuff going on with Canon and Nikon. They were very late to the party with mirrorless, and they have always been systems designed around iterations rather than upgrades. Specifically, Fujifilm is well known for the Kaizen, constant improvement firmware upgrades. It's like you get a brand new camera every time you get a new firmware update. In fact, they improve things and add features that users are asking for, and they do it free, or at least they have. I've heard rumors that they might change that and start charging. I don't know. In any event, Canon and Nikon very much opposed that idea. They were very stalwart and very slow to adapt when mirrorless came about, specifically when Sony bought Minolta and got the Alpha mount and came out with the Alphas. In order for Sony to beat Canon and Nikon's market share, which took them years, and it wasn't really until the A7 I or the A7 Mark I and Mark II that they started to pick up some track with the A7S1 and A7S2, and then the A7S or the A7 III really took them into place, was they always added additional features. There was always more software gimmicks that were available in those cameras. Gimmicks is what I quote, air quotes, to call them, but the reality is the ability to have a direct DSLT, which was a different type of, it was a different type of DSLR instead of a single lens reflex that pops up like a digital. It was a single lens translucent, and that lost about a third of a stop of light, some say even a half. But what it gave you was on-sensor phase detection while you were doing video, while you were doing photos, things like that. Maybe not for video. I'll take that back. I think it was for video, but I don't recall right now. However, that made the cameras focus faster. Well, Nikon and Canon didn't really have much to worry about at that time, but they were slow to adapt to technologies like that, which were gimmicky, as they called it. Turns out that technology directly led the way for stuff like the dual pixel autofocus and things because of hybrid contrast, phase detect, as well as contrast detect. These are types of things that were approached in two separate directions, but kind of merged together. And that is just an example of where I'm saying that Canon specifically holds back features and is very iterative. I'd like to share with you how that continues to be iterative to this day when it comes to cameras and why I chose Panasonic, and I would still choose Panasonic today, most likely over a Canon. Now, you get if we're talking the Canon 705 or 605, hey, no, if I'm spending $5,000, no problem there. Those 1-inch cameras are absolute beasts. They give you everything in that camera. In fact, they came out with the 605, which is kind of better than the 705 in many ways in order to reduce price on the professional end. But it's still a $5,000 camera. And we're not talking about $5,000 cameras. We're talking about cameras between the $1,500 and $2,500 price point. Here's what Panasonic did. People ask me this question all the time, and I really wish Panasonic did a better job of getting the information out there. Recognizing that the HC-X1500, 2000, and CX10 are all the exact same camera. The body, the frame, the entire thing is the same. The only difference is, and the sensor as well, the image stabilization, the build, the screen, all of it. The only difference is between the 1500 in the United States and the 2000 in the United States. Let's see if I can do this backwards. You get a top handle included and a 3G SDI port. Now this is very important. That means that there's no additional codec, there's no additional anything. If you just buy the base 1500 for $1,600 and then a few months or a year later want to buy the handle and you don't need 3G SDI, you don't have to pay the $2,000, $2,200 entry price for the handle with the HC-X2000. You pay the licensing fee in the cost for the 3G SDI. The same thing with the AG CX10, which is the big broadcast brother of these cameras. that gives you the same 3G SDI as well as an NDI out, as well as a P2 profile built in. Those are the only differences. So in the camera with with Panasonic, when you buy their HC-X1500 or 2000 or CX10, you as a consumer can rest assured that you're getting the exact same camera no matter which one you buy. You're just purchasing options that you might actually use. Okay. We haven't even talked about something very important that all of the Panasonics do. They give you 422 10-bit HDMI out at whatever resolution and frame rate you're streaming. Canon doesn't do that. You get 8-bit 1080p on the 605s and the 70, not the 605, on the 65, 75, 60, and 70. Now, when we take that and look at Canon, with Canon, they have made their entire line iterative. They had to create 4 camera bodies based on the exact same frame, that they aren't the same inside. Specifically, they aren't the same with sensor size between the two. It's basically 2 different lines, and they don't have the same feature sets between them. Most of the feature sets are the same, right? But you get with the 75 model and the 65 model, you get to open up additional software features with those purchases, which, to be quite true, is fair. Panasonic did the same thing, but Panasonic did the same thing differently. They gave you one camera from the get-go that you could customize how you needed. They didn't need 3 different camera lines. They didn't need 4 separate cameras to accommodate this. In fact, they're so brazen with it. On here, the only place that you will find the HC-X1500 is on the nameplate underneath. They put no labeled branding on the main body so that they could ship any bodied camera that they needed. In fact, the cutouts for the 3G SDI and the NDI are already here. In fact, the USB port for the NDI is available here right now. If I had a software unlock, I could use the NDI port that's available through the USB to NDI adapter. But I didn't pay for it because I didn't need it. So why would I spend that extra cash? Okay. To wrap this part up, I want to make clear, I guess, because it can get kind of fuzzy, what I'm actually saying. What I'm saying is that Canon brought out 4 cameras at 4 separate price points to address other people, each different market. No problem. That was an amount of cost involved with that, with creating the different bodies. There was an amount of feature reduction from the different bodies, which makes it more difficult for you to choose, which is why I get this question all the time. However, Panasonic did not. Panasonic came out with 1 camera and made the camera a modular, upgradable system for the most part. I mean, it's an integrated camera system, but it allows users to purchase what they need and when they need it. That's pretty cool. Think about the workflow and think about how much money that saves Panasonic, right? Think about how much of that savings is passed on to you. Should you choose to get the Panasonic AG-CX10, their big boy, their flagship, $2,500, you will still have more features than you would in a similar priced and spec'd Canon XA75. In the Canon, you will get a larger sensor. In the Panasonic, you will get a larger zoom, right? However, you will also get that 10-bit internal. You will also get the 10-bit HDMI out. You will also get the SDI and the NDI, things that you don't get on Canon's camera. And oh wait, goodness, you'll get it at about $200 less. So, my point is in framing. Panasonic put it all in one and lets you choose a very easy price point based on what you want with all the features. There's nothing extra. You don't have to buy their HC-X2, HC-X20, or their AG-CX350 to get 4K 60. You don't have to spend more money to get it. And you don't have to get 4K 60 at 10-bit. You don't have to spend more money to get it. You can get it on their base model. They bundled all of their best technology in one spot for you. Canon and Nikon have historically never done that, which is why I don't buy them, because I don't like to purchase iterations. If you guys have heard me talk about cameras, you recognize I look at cameras as modular, fit-to-mission specific tools. So I would want a tool that could always do the job I needed it to. I wouldn't want to have multiple tools that all do very separate jobs unless those jobs are highly specific. And since we're talking about a very highly specific job like a camcorder, I need it to do all the things. That's why I don't buy Canon. Now, why wouldn't I buy? Let's say you've heard this and you say, Rob, I understand you didn't buy Canon, but this doesn't sound like a deal breaker for me, and I really like Canon. I have to agree with you. Their cameras are sexy. They've got appeal. They feel good in the hands. If you guys have ever seen a video I talked about this HC-X1500, you know I hate the buttons. You know I think that Panasonic engineered the buttons wrong. I don't like the way the ring feels. It's not that it's not well built. It's that there's very little tactile feel and function. The crazy part is Panasonic knows how to build a camcorder. In this HC-X1 right here, the buttons feel great. Everything moves. It has its own proper purchase feeling and resistance. There's no creakiness. It's excellent. Even though the display screen is a resistive touch, terrible screen, it works. Canon doesn't have that problem. I have never picked up a Canon and thought to myself, this doesn't feel right. That's one of Canon's appeal. This is something I think they do better than any manufacturer. You guys know I like Sony. You guys know I like Fujifilm. You know that my favorite camera, if you ever saw my switch to Nikon, which didn't last long, but my switch to Nikon was the best. The Nikon D750, in my opinion, was the best feeling mirrorless, well, not mirrorless, but digital camera. I'm trying to say it's a DSLR and I was shooting mirrorless, but I'm getting confused here. My point was, watch that review. It felt great. The camera was probably the most robust camera I have ever used. And I still didn't stick around with it because for me, although it felt great, I needed something a little bit different for my whole process. And it's a very personal thing. But I do recognize that Canon and Nikon both just get ergonomics right. Where else will Canon get you right? Dual pixel autofocus. There is no question in my mind that when it comes to camcorders, dual pixel autofocus, Canon's autofocus is unmatched. Unmatched. Period. I don't deny that. I love Canon's autofocus. If Canon would have changed years ago, or could change now, and to stop making iterative products, but making products that are more where your features aren't put behind price tags, I think they wouldn't be in the financial trouble that they're in now, right? Think the fact that they launched those 4 cameras just to compete with one camera from Panasonic. Not only were they competing with Panasonic, but you get my point. Panasonic needed to release one camera in a relatively modular system with the handle and upgrades, but Canon released 4 to do the same thing. And they're not 4 systems that are modular to one another. They're 4 completely different bodies. And they still didn't give their best bodies, their most expensive bodies. You still can't pay $2,700 to Canon and get the XA75 with 422 10-bit internal codec recording. It doesn't happen. And you definitely aren't getting 422 10-bit HDMI out. Which means that because I get 422 10-bit HDMI out, I don't get Apple ProRes RAW, but I get a true 422 10-bit out at whatever my frame rate is. So when I plug in my Ninja, which I do often if I choose to record at DNx HR at 160 or 500 megabits per second, I can get an extraordinarily usable, gradable image, even better than the 200 megabit per second 422 or 420 60 frames a second that's internal, or 422 30 frames a second 10-bit internal, all by adding a Ninja. You can't do that with your Canon. So again, they've crippled by features. So the things that I sacrifice on when I choose to sacrifice for camera or camcorder are the things that don't have anything to do with recording. Like, yes, the camera might feel great. The Canon XA65 might feel great in your hands, and it might have great dual pixel autofocus. But the autofocus in this Panasonic HC-X1500 isn't bad. It's Panasonic's autofocus in their camcorders has been well ahead, in my opinion, of their depth from defocus DFD technology for a long time. 2 different teams working on the same technology 2 different ways. I've never had a problem with my autofocus here. But Panasonic does do us one little solid. They stick us hard. I'm being facetious here. It's not good at all. They reserve face detect autofocus for your fully manual mode on this camera. It's ridiculous. It's not on any of their other cameras. And I know why they do it. It's because their manual controls are very fiddly. But they're also making a huge statement about this camera. I trust this camera to get great exposures. I can use my exposure compensation and stuff inside if I want inside the camera. I can actually put this in full auto and just kind of leave it alone. It'll do a great job. That's how far Panasonic has come with their camcorders. Final thing I'd like to say is where I think you will find the biggest benefit, and that is zoom versus sensor size. If it's a question between the 60 or 65, the XA60 or 65 by Canon, and simply the HC-X1500 or 2000, get the HC-X1500 or 2000 all day long. Better price, more features, period. Full stop. If it's a question of the HC-X1500 or 2000 CX10 versus the Canon XA70 or 75, now we actually have a real difference that could be meaningful to you. We have a difference of sensor size. And I brought it up earlier, but let's talk about it now. The sensor in the XA70 and 75 is a 1-inch sensor. This is a 1/2.5. It's basically a 1/2 inch sensor. So the sensor in the Canon is larger. That means that it can, well, it should be better in low light. It's been my experience that cameras with larger sensors are always better in low light when everything else is given the same variable. So if your aperture is the same, your ISO is the same, and your shutter speed is the same, a larger sensor will give you better low light performance. But that's a very broad statement. It generalizes a lot, because if you know a lot about cinematography or videography, if you know about light, then you don't really, you know what those limitations are, and you know how to work your gear around those limitations. People think a lot of times you have to push your gain up in order to get rid of noise in the darkness with a small sensor. No, bring it down. Use your rim light, your available ambient light, your environmental light, your spill light, things like that. Don't push it up, because then you show the noise. Pull it down so you show the highlights, and then let that silhouette or illuminate. There's lots of different ways to do it. That's just one. So I'm not so worried about sensor size, but it does make a difference. The other thing that you'll note is that you're only going to get a 15 times zoom on the XA70 and 75, a 20 times zoom on the smaller sensor, the same, very similar sensor size as the Panasonic HC-X1500 series, of 20 times zoom compared to 24 times zoom. I'm telling you, there's no doubt that that is a gigantic feature of this camera. And in order to combat that low light capability, Panasonic did something unexpected that works great. If you look at the specifications between the new XA70 with that 1-inch sensor and Panasonic's HC-X1500, this camera right here, you'll find that HC-X1500 has a maximum illumination of 1.5 lux at the 24 millimeter telephoto at 1/30th of a second at base ISO. Okay? What is 1.5 lux? I'll tell you that in a second. But the larger sensored camera from Canon, in the same conditions, just like we said, variables, well, it has a lowest maximum illumination of 1.7 lux. So it's only 0.2 lux better. And why is that? I'll tell you why it is, and I'll explain what that looks like to you on a moonlit night. It's because when Panasonic created this camera, I got to take this off just so that you can see it. They made it with the telephoto in instead of being 2.8 to 4.5, like all other camcorders out there, including the Canons we're talking about right now. They said, you know, since it's a smaller sensor, instead of going wide at 2.8, let's make our aperture wide at 1.8. Well, you and I both know that's a complete stop difference, right? So it's letting in a complete stop more light at its widest as a smaller sensor. However, the lux rating between the two cameras, the 75 or the 70 and the HC-X1500, are really just about 0.2 lux apart. So what does that mean? What is a lux, right? So I wanted to tell you, I was thinking about that. Lux is candela illumination. I don't really get into this too much, but I was thinking about it. I had a cool chart I was pulling up for you. Yeah, so I found it right here. One lux itself is between twilight and deep twilight, right? So we're talking about deep twilight going into before the full moon is about 1.08 lux, right? Twilight is about 10 lux. So if you think about after evening nautical twilight, when the sun gets 15 degrees below the horizon, about 30 minutes after that is we get into twilight, and about an hour after that is when we get into dark twilight or deep twilight on a moonless night, right? And so that's what we're talking about when we say 1 lux, 1.5, 1.75 lux. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense to think about it that way. So just envision what it looks like outside your house. Let's say that you don't live in the city, or you can go to a park area or someplace that doesn't have as much light pollution. About an hour after sunset, we usually call it blue hour. That's your regular twilight, right? And then you get into deep twilight as that passes, going into that next hour until the moon begins to rise, if there's a moon coming in that night. So when you talk about darkness, both of these cameras say that they're rated for that. And in my personal experience with this camera, you guys have seen it, is that it performs extremely well. Check out my HC-X1500 at the pier, right? The Virginia Beach fishing pier. And I got beautiful shots for it at the fishing pier in that environment where I was photographing sunsets and after sunset in the twilight, deep twilight. Afterwards, for the rest of that video, I was photographing and doing videography out there in an area that was environmentally well lit because it was kind of a carnival beach scene for the Strip in Virginia Beach. Lots of neon light, lots of fluorescent light and halogen and sodium lamps, lots of light out there, but still dark. Using the camera appropriately, either one of them, you would get great results. However, a larger sensor will always do better in lower light. So I think that's why I'm going to hang my hat on this one. If you were asking me which one I would want, if it was between any of the cameras for any reason, and we weren't talking specific lens spec or sensor size, I would choose the Panasonic because it's got 422 10-bit. And it's got HDMI 422 10-bit out, so internal and external, right? If you were asking me to compare any of the cameras based on sensor size, then yes, the HC-X1500, I wouldn't even consider the Canon XA70 or 65 because they're in the same class. They're a 1/2.3 inch sensor compared to 1/2.5 inch. It's 0.2 of an inch difference between them. It's not enough of a difference to make a difference. And you get a 24 times zoom compared to a 20 times zoom on the Canon. And you get the 10-bit internal that you don't get on the Canon. And you get the 60 frames a second 4K that you don't get on the Canon. And you get the 422 10-bit output at whatever your frame rate is from HDMI on Panasonic. It's a no-brainer. You will get 4 channels of audio compared to the 2 channels of audio on the Canon. All the Canon models will give you 4 channels of audio. You only get 2 left and right on the Panasonic. So I would scratch the 60s and 65s off your list. Okay. Now, if you were asking me between the 70, 75 for Canon, the XA70 and 75, that's different. That's different because Canon is bringing a larger sensor, right? And to be quite fair, in the 70 and 75, they're really comparing that camera, that they're competing against the new Panasonic HC-X2 and HC-X20. This is the previous generation, but the ones that replaced this one. And in those instances, Canon has a better price point. Still, in those instances, Panasonic will give you more features, right? They're going to give you that 422 10-bit out. They're going to give you the longer zoom, 20 times zoom compared to 15 times zoom. And they're going to give you the 422 10-bit 60 frames internal in 4K. That's just how it is, right? So if you were asking me between this camera and the 70 and 75 between the Canon, I would think a little bit more closely about what and when I was going to photograph and shoot. If I was worried about, like as a wedding photographer, videographer, I usually have to have a camera that's a long ways away that can shoot real telephoto for the videography. So 24 times zoom outside on a beach wedding, this makes sense. It's a bright sunny day. If you're telling me which one in between on a wetting inside, a 1-inch sensor wetting reception inside, neither of them are going to do great, but the 1-inch camera will always do better, everything else being the same. So when I use this inside for wettings, I have to shoot in the wide angle. I can't do any zooming, which I wouldn't do. So I'm at the 24 millimeter, I'm at f1.8, and I have to use extra light. I just don't really use it inside for that purpose because it doesn't perform as well as I'd like. It's that simple. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it and hang my hat. Guys, I like these cameras no matter which one. I hope that you could tell that through the conversation. I hope you made it through the dialogue. This was a long video, kind of technical, but I hope I presented it to you as a story rather than a lecture, right? I hope that you came along with me for the journey to see where I was going. If you did, please go ahead, like, subscribe, leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear what your experience is. Tell me what you think. If this video was really helpful to you and it helps you make a buying decision, please use one of the Amazon links. Whatever you purchase will, well, directly support me. It's that simple. And lastly, if you think I did a great enough job where you'd like to support me with a beer or a cup of coffee, hit that PayPal button and send me a couple bucks. I'd be happy to give you a shout out and a thank you. Guys, I want to thank you for watching. Remind you, I'm Rob, and I'll catch you all on the flip side. Bye for now.